welcome you all to the ICS book discussion. Today, we'll be discussing a very important book on China titled China's Search for National Rejuvenation, edited by Dr. Jabinti Jacob and Dr. Hoang The Anh. Both the authors are here with us today to discuss their book. Joining them today are fellow contributors Dr. Nyao Chaoping and Dr. Chi Loi. To give a brief introduction about the authors, Dr. Jabinti Jacob is the co-editor of the volume and is associate professor in the Department of International Relations and Government Studies at the Hanoi University and adjunct research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. He was formerly fellow and assistant director at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. Dr. Jacob's research interests include Chinese domestic politics, China-South Asia relations, Sino-India border areas, Indian and Chinese worldviews, and center-province relations in China. Dr. Hoang The Anh is a senior researcher at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences, with 25 years of experience studying China. He has held the position of Vice Director General of the Institute of Chinese Studies at the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences for 10 years and is currently also the editor-in-chief of Vietnam's Chinese Studies Review. Dr. Huang specializes in China's economy, society, and development strategy and on Vietnam-China relations. Dr. Chi Loi is Associate Professor and Director General at the Institute of American Studies in Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences and has also been a Fulbright Fellow at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Su's interests cover US-China strategic competition, the US economy, as well as the Vietnam-China relations. Vietnam-US relations, sorry. Then we have finally Dr. Nyao Chaoping, who is Director of the Institute of China Studies at the University of Malaya. Dr. Niao's research interests include China's political reforms, organization and management of the Chinese Communist Party, China's minorities, and China-Southeast Asia relations. And to chair the session today, we have Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, Honorary Fellow and former Chairperson of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi, and former Professor of at the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. Before I invite the chair to conduct the proceedings, let me explain some ground rules. All participants shall be muted when the speakers make their presentation. Once the chair has opened the floor for the discussion, participants may indicate their interest in asking questions by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the list of participants. Questions can also be sent to us through the chat option. The chair will call upon the participants to ask their questions. The concerned participant will unmute himself or herself. Meanwhile, other participants are requested to keep themselves muted. I'll now invite the chair, Professor Mohanty, to begin the proceedings and offer his opening remarks. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Rija. It's a very special occasion because it's an international project which has fruitioned into a very interesting book. Actually, I was just mentioning a little while ago that I visited Vietnam in 2002, January. I don't know whether Ambassador Saurabh Kumar has joined. He was the ambassador there then. After that, or just before that, G.P. Deshpande, the late Professor G.P. Deshpande, he visited. And for about 10 years, we had a lot of exchanges. And we used to meet in China or elsewhere, or Vietnam and here in India, a lot of programs. So I'm so glad during the last 10 years or so, the new generation of China scholars have re-established this very close interaction among the China scholars. Today, we even have a scholar from Malaysia who had joined. He's also the director of Center for Chinese Studies. So we have 3 ICSs, 3 institutes of Chinese studies involved today. So I'm very happy at this meeting. Now, this book is very important for 2 reasons. Because after the 19th Party Congress of the CPC, several volumes were produced, including one by the ICS, which I have edited, China at a Turning Point, Perspectives After the 19th Party Congress, where many of you have contributed. This book has taken the domestic and international as an integrated process, where it almost suggests that it is the domestic which directs the international relations. I mean, that is my construction. The editors may have their views, but in other words, the domestic dimensions of China, the party, the development needs, the social contradictions, the economic successes and problems, the social sector experiences, that above all, capital and technology situation in China, and the reform experience in general, it had its necessary foreign policy dimension. So that is one very distinct dimension of this book. The second important point about this volume is taking national rejuvenation of a particular kind, that is the Xi Jinping kind, very seriously. We have all taken Xi Jinping leadership, his control over the party, the army, the security apparatus, the propaganda, the foreign policy, and culminating in the Xi Jinping thought. We have all taken that seriously. But here, a set of essays, particularly the propaganda section, that is a very important set of papers on propaganda, and the section on foreign policy and security. I think these two sections, as well as the party-centric governance essays that many people have focused on, I think they gave a very special thrust. They indicate a special thrust of the Xi Jinping, not only touch, the Xi Jinping profile being manifest in all sectors of the domestic and foreign policies. And we will have, one of the editors to begin, Dr. Huang, then some of the authors to present. I may also come in between. And then we have two discussants, and they are the latest among the best products of our Indian programs, P.K. Anand and Bhim Subba, who in a big way were trained not only in their universities, JNU and DU, but I would say mainly by the ICS, wherever they may be, we have a certain special relationship with them. They will be the discussants. And then we'll have question answer. After the discussants, I will invite the other editor, Javin Jacob, to come in to make his presentation in response, as well as his own additional contribution. I think 7 to 8 minutes maximum, so that we can have a good amount of time for discussion. So I'm very happy that this is taking place on a book that we are all very happy to see as a joint product of Indian and Vietnamese scholarship. So with these words, may I invite Professor Hoang The Anh, one of the editors of the book, and a senior China expert from Vietnam, to make his presentation. Dr. Huang.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Manrozaten Mohati, for kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Indian Institute of Chinese Study in and Indian colleagues for your effort to collect and organize this discussion of this book today. It's an honor for me. This is the second time of co-editor the book with Associate Professor Sapin Jacob. This is also the first time that colleagues from India, Malaysia, and Vietnam has made a joint effort to contribute to the book, in which classifying of China contemporary policy. Once again, on behalf of Associate Professor Dr. Sapin Jacob, I would like to thank all contributors of the book. I think that this book reveals Xi Jinping, the role and power increasingly strengthened, become to the core leading of Communist Party of China, with the measure to rectify the party, enhance and strengthen its leadership of Communist Party of China, which is mainly through anti-corruption. China also changed the economic development model toward a more sustainable development model in the future, emphasizing the scientific and technological innovation. This book had also identified China policy change in the area of national governance, such as economy, politics, military, science and technology, and foreign policy, in order to extending influence in the region of and in the world of China. This shows that China ambition to become a global power today, and after China implicitly allows its global strategy as the 19th Congress of Chinese Communist Party, China has also taken many assertive actions in the territorial sovereignty dispute and also dispute with India, and the maritime and Iceland sovereignty dispute with neighboring country in Southeast Asia, like South China Sea and with East China Sea with Japan. China more clearly show its intention to replace the U.S. position in the Pacific, Asian sub-Pacific region, and challenge American power in terms of economy, security, and prosperity, leading to start of a new period of full and fair competition between US and China. In particular, the book has asserted the strength of the successful open door of China or open door reform over 40 years, such as some achievement like that the pupil livelihoods and reduction of poverty, setting up modern open infrastructure becomes the world's second largest economy and emerging as an influence world power and has remarkable achievement. However, China also faces many challenges, such as increasing social and regional inequality, environment pollution, social alienation, curtailment of freedom, and persisting corruption are some of the problems. It is worth mentioning that the rising and national rejuvenation of China today has met with the skepticism and opinion of the neighboring country, and in particular, created this competition with the US This will create this distrust with the withdrawal proposed by China. This also raises the deepest question whether China's national rejuvenation process will bring peace, development, and prosperity to the region and the world or not. With the above, I think that the book has two important meanings as follows. Firstly, contributing to promoting research cooperation, shares view and information among India, Malaysian, and Vietnamese scholars in research our laboring power, arising China and has both positive and negative effects on us. Secondly, to contribute to the International Academy to identify China's national rejuvenation process. From the success of this book, I could like to raise some questions for us to discuss for the joint cooperation among scholars from India, Malaysia, and Vietnam in the next book. Perhaps we can invite some more countries, more scholars from the other country, from three countries, to take part in the next book. After the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic around the world, it changed the domestic and foreign policy of many countries, in which how will the thematic and China and foreign policy of China change continue to be the focus of attention in the world. How will China impact in the region and the world in the post-COVID era? How will the land country cooperate, compete, and effect in the region and in the world? For example, the Myanmar coup in region. How about the role of China and the US insists in Myanmar now? With many questions we need to answer. So after this discussion today, I think that the Indian, Malaysian, and Vietnamese scholar here should choose a common interested topic to write the new book about China with the war or the reason. And we also can invite more other country scholars to work together in the new book. From Vietnam side, I will happy to do the coordinator to gather Vietnamese scholar to contact with other country. Finally, on the occasion of the Lunar New Year in Vietnam, I wish all of you a happy New Year. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Huang. Happy New Year to you and your colleagues from India. Thank you for identifying the dimensions of the book as well as the possible cooperation avenues that we have. Next, may I invite Dr. Chi Loi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to convey a message of Happy New Year to all of you from India today. Still New Year in Vietnam. Today is the first working day for amongst Vietnamese.
Oh,
so
great.
I would like to convey our message of a New Year to all of you. We wish you a Happy New Year, a good health, prosperity, and great success in this year. And I'm very happy to join our web webinar today with joining a lot of from the Indian scholar and pretty said that only two scholars from Vietnam, Dr. Thế Anh and myself. So I'm very happy to join our discussion today. But first of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Mr. Jacob Jabin and Mr. Thế Anh for inviting me to join the book. I think this is a great opportunity for me to join with international scholar to write a book. And I think it's a very important book, and it's very significant for myself. So I joined this book with a chapter of strategic competition between China and United in the Pacific. For this chapter, my main argument is that China, after 3 decades of strong economic growth, has caused them to fundamentally change their strategic stand in Asia as well as Indo-Pacific. By modernizing its military and implementing the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives, China wants to take a control of Indo-Pacific. China wants to push the US outside Asia and replace the US leadership in the region. The rise of China and China's new foreign policy are threatening to US interests in the Indo-Pacific region. To a certain extent, China is completely legitimate in modernizing its military to protect its interests, especially their import and export to the Indo-Pacific sea lines. However, China claims it's too excessive, and China's attitude is too aggressive and coercive. Given the fact that the US has been the superpower in the Asia and the Gulf, current China foreign policy is threatening China's interest in the Indo-Pacific, and is undermining the China leadership in Indo-Pacific region. The US cannot accept Chinese challenges, and therefore, strategic competition between US and China in Indo-Pacific region is inevitable now and in the future. Recently, the United States have increased its military presence, especially its Navy in the Indo-Pacific regions, carry out the Indo-Pacific strategy, enticing the country to follow the waging trade war with China, punishing some Chinese officials and Chinese companies. The US-Chinese relation has becoming very tense now. My chapter also discusses the impact of US-China strategic competition in the Asian region. I think the competition will make the security issue in the region become more tense and the risk of US-China conflict increasing the chance of security instability in the region. The country in the region will face many difficulties in implementing their foreign policy with US and China. And the US-China competitions may cause a risk of division and conflict between the country in the region. So in short, ongoing the US-China strategic competition is inevitable, stemming from China's rise and China's ambition. And this strategic competition will continue for a long time. And the US and China strategic competition will change the international relations in the region in a more difficult direction. So that's my main argument for my chapters. I would like to take this opportunity again to thank Mr. Jacob Japin and Ms. Anh. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for listening. And I am very happy to have further discussion with you on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chu, especially spelling out the dimensions of the what you call the inevitable China-US strategic competition, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Well, next, I want to come in as a contributor to the volume. May sound odd, but let me do that. So my chapter is on political and economic policies of Xi Jinping. This was written before the COVID, Therefore, and I have a thesis. I hope some of you know that. I have this book, China's Transformation, the Success Story and the Success Trap, a study of the 40 years of reforms based on my fieldwork in UC. And every chapter talks about the national scene and the scene seen from UC, from a rural, now a suburban Xiang township. Now, where I have a thesis, which I have presented also in this chapter. The thesis is that there are important economic successes of the 40 years of reforms. Everybody knows that. But there are serious problems which have been generated by that path of development because of the logic of that growth-centric development path. That has brought highly developed infrastructure, increased livelihood generally, and so on. And China's status in the world has grown. But as Professor Hoang The Anh mentioned, the rising inequalities, regional disparities, gender disparities, ethnic alienation, day-to-day problems of that the Chinese face, problems of livelihood and ordinary life, and above all, the environmental degradation. And my thesis in this chapter is that Xi Jinping's the first 2 years after the 19th Party Congress show that there is no change in that situation. There are many new policies, the party-centric governance and many other things, but there is no indication that they have been able to overcome the success trap. And I would now add that the COVID experience has further confirmed that the success part was evident in the well-organized authoritarian system enforcing lockdown, discipline, and some health measures and achieving containment of the virus. I think that was a great success. It has also led to revival of the economy and return of normalcy on so many fronts. But inequality between the rural-urban sectors, the conditions of migrant labor, gender disparity, unemployment, the conditions of the floating population in the cities, environmental degradation, despite the 13th plan, environmental plans having been achieved actually. And the 14th plan makes a lot of very important promises. But the path of development is such that it creates a certain use of energy, traditional energy, fuel-based energy. Therefore, the abolition of coal-based energy is not coming as fast as it should. China, of course, is the world's largest producer and exporter of renewable energy, including solar energy. But still, its growth path creates emission to such an extent that it is the highest emitter in the world. And despite the fact that by 2060, there will be zero emission according to President Xi Jinping's statement in the UN, even then, the present scenario is unfolding, showing the success trap continuing. And on the foreign policy front, this domestic situation is evident because they want to maintain the BRI, which has gotten a certain setback during the COVID, but they do want to continue with the infrastructure investment and the general BRI process. So I have I have two questions. One is there is a global question about the development path. And I think the post-COVID global discourse should directly address that and alter this path of development. But there are no signs of that, either from EU, US, or even China. The same path they want to continue with minor adjustments in terms of health needs and other needs, environment needs. That is the global question. The Chinese question is, yes, they have achieved the 2020 target of poverty elimination, absolute poverty elimination. But absolute poverty is not everything. The relative deprivation, relative poverty, and the dimensions of deprivation and discomfort and exploitation are extremely visible in so many sectors. Therefore, the 14th plan ought to have shown some change of path, and it doesn't show that. So that is my chapter and its implications for China's coming years. Thank you very much. Now, may I now request Professor New Chaoping from Malaysia to make his contribution.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty, and I would like to congratulate again, Happy New Year to all the friends here, even though I don't know whether Indians celebrate this New Year, but I'm happy to meet many old friends and new friends here and my fellow authors in this edited book, especially Dr. Hoang The Anh and Dr. Jabin Jacob for inviting me to be part of this project. I understand that before that it was more Vietnamese-Indian collaboration, and I'm very glad to add in a Malaysia component into it. I'm asked to briefly talk about my chapter, which is about party-based diplomacy, that the Chinese Communist Party has its own party-to-party diplomacy unit called the International Department. Basically, in this chapter, I survey what has been the major changes, or I would say more like a very subtle transformation or changes, and in the sense that traditionally the party-based diplomacy is the mission is quite simple or quite straightforward, is to deal with other political elites that are or are not in the governing parties of other countries. So basically, it's about the political elite, the party to party that can reach out to minor parties, opposition parties, ruling parties, also and so forth. Of course, each with different regions, with different kind of implications, is much more important in relationship with socialist countries like North Korea, or perhaps our Vietnamese friends can tell more about China-Vietnam party-to-party ties. But in the other countries, it plays different functions. But in my chapter, I also discussed that in the past couple of years, there is a very interesting growing network of relationship that this party-based diplomacy has been cultivating. My original chapter title actually is about cultivating relationship or cultivating network or something like that, I forgot. But what I discovered is that more than political elites, now is very interested to cultivate networks, ties, relationship, friendship or whatever, with not just the political elites, the party politicians, but now including the business sector. So it's the economic elites, even the intellectual sector, the think tanks. Now is part of the engagement of this think tank, international think tank network, and so on and so forth. And the social elite, in the sense that it is behind some of the NGOs diplomacy or NGOs engagement between China and some of the other countries. So the kind of the networks that this particular units, the international department is fostering now, is actually more than the traditional party to party anymore. Now it's actually across the fronts. Even though I would say that in other sectors, the business, the NGO, and so on and so forth, it is not necessarily the most dominant one. There are other actors in Chinese foreign policy bureaucracy that carry out, but the net has been cast wide, so to speak. So that is, I think, one of the major changes that have occurred in the past couple of years. It didn't started under Xi Jinping. I think before that, the phenomena has already been like that. but it picked up definitely under Xi leadership. And under Xi's leadership, another theme that I mentioned is that it's a lot more proactive in terms of what the Chinese would like to call telling the Chinese stories. Or outside the world, we'll call this just propaganda. But for China, is that we have to do a better job in terms of making China better understood and so on and so forth. And the international department in engaging this wider network of elite actors in other countries do fulfill and play that job in terms of engaging and telling others the story or the perspective or the narratives from China. And I think this will go on. The international departments, for a while, I think after the Cold War or something like that, was thought to be losing its significance, that the Chinese foreign policy, the whole system will become much more professionalized and much more normalized, in a sense that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will become the major actor and the international department will become slowly marginalized or phased out. That did not happen. It stayed on. It has taken up new importance and significance. And another thing that I think, other than these wider networks, this proactive outreach of propaganda, is that it is now more confident through these party-to-party ties, or to these networks, to showcase China's lessons, China model. And in the past, party-to-party, people say that it is a conduit for others to influence China, but now it's actually more likely the other way around as well. The way that the party-to-party ties have been conducted in Africa or in some other countries, you can see that how they actually become a major conduits for China to share its governance ideas and visions and so on and so forth. So I think this has become a very significant actor on its own. It's not being marginalized in any way, and it will continue to stay in the years to come. So that is basically my analysis in this particular chapter. And once again, I'm very happy to have this virtual meeting with the many friends here, especially actually Professor Mohanty. I know you are kind of the big name in India China Studies Circle. I'm very glad to meet you over here virtually, and I will be happy to continue to join this project in the future if we continue and if I'm invited again, of course. All right, that is my my brief speech here, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nyao. That was wonderful, emphasizing parties' direct foreign policy initiatives and the proactive dimension of selling or propagating China's experience and China's stories. Thank you. Well, now is the time for our discussions. Am I right, Jamin? And may I now invite, I have great pleasure in inviting Dr. Bhim Bahadur Subba, our former fellow at the ICS and now assistant professor, political science, University of Hyderabad. Bhim.
Thank you, sir. And and once again, Happy New Year to the Vietnamese and the Malaysian friends here. And as well as even like, I just want to say that even Indians do celebrate. We have a lot of Tibetan, diaspora here, and as well as Tibetans in Himalayas, and we do celebrate Tibet, New Year during this time. So, yeah. Having said that, So, with regard to the book, I will actually, when I make intervention here, at how much time do I have, sir? It should be 5 minutes. Sir? Yeah. So, I will actually, I will engage the book or the sections that I am supposed to review for this, for this talk. I will engage not on the basis of the chapters, but I will really look into the overall theme that the chapters have really engaged to understand and really dealt with. And from the the sections that I'm looking into it is the second unit and the fifth unit, which is on propaganda, which Dr. Ping just actually made a presentation on. So having said that, I will just come to the methodology of the book itself. When this book, as the title really resonates, it's China's Search for National Rejuvenation. So at the outset, I'm trying to really engage with. So is China's idea of rejuvenation, is it benign? Or does it is questioning how China only under Xi Jinping is going to achieve great status. So is that, or that China's dream of rejuvenation, China dream versus rejuvenation, does it link to whether it leads to reforms or restructure? So how do we really see China's rejuvenation as an important hypothesis that has really looked into this? And looking at the second part of the book itself, like the title itself, it focuses on domestic and foreign policies, yeah, and latching onto these policies that the authors have really discussed actually brings forth to what really China's rejuvenation policies have been. And uh, and the other aspect that I can see is that the 19th party 19 party Congress becomes an important departure here in engaging or studying China's rejuvenation dream, I would say, and the steps. And looking and looking at the same time with the authors, how they're dwelling on these resources, they really look into the primary resource materials, which is very, very enriching. And that, and the I want to tell the audience here, those resources or the references at the end of the chapter of each chapters are really, really important for other students who want to really understand what China is thinking about, or the party is thinking about, and the leaders are thinking about. So the dwell is on the, on how policy documents are engaged. So there is a textual analysis done by the authors here in reading these documents and their interpretations, in bringing out forth what are the important arguments laid down on the Xi Jinping and especially post 19th Party Congress. And the other aspect that I really want to focus is on how all the authors have tried to use an institutional framework in bringing in bringing out the arguments, or in researching this book or these chapters here. Because the very first chapter, it deals upon how party and state apparatus reforms has happened here. And when amendments with regard to national supervision commissions, these discussions are being being discussed here. And at the same time, although the chapters on economy, chapters on economy and politics, and other aspects of the PLA reform, military reforms. So usually when we look at it, so rejuvenation of China, or China's rejuvenation in domestic and as well as foreign, definitely harps or is based on the institutions. And mind you, the institutions are both not only the state institutions, but as well as the party institutions. Yeah. So these chapters really bring in forth, this book brings in forth the idea how institutions have played an important role. However, at the caveat, I also see that when policies on domestic and and on foreign issues are concerned, ideology and institutions are important aspect. But who are the movers and shakers here? So although Xi Jinping, the book itself says under Xi Jinping, so how are we trying to, although the major today popular literature and many of the newspaper comments say that Xi Jinping is the core and he runs the show in China, but is it really that? So the leadership aspect actually could have been explored more in any one of the chapters, or have been discussed here. That would have really helped the book to be the chapters or the debates to be really in sync with other aspects of the book. And the chapters on international department by Dr. Ping and Dr. Liu's chapter on propaganda department. This stands out. I think these are one of the best some of the best works recently that I've read about personally, and how China's domestic dream of rejuvenation has really led to foreign policy making steps here. And here, when I will talk about here, like how restructuring of these institutions, or whether you call it reforms, or is it today when we talk about reforms or rejuvenation, is China really talking about reforms? Is China talking, when you say rejuvenation, are you strengthening the old system, or are you trying to really become what old is it that what China was before 200 or 300 centuries before? So these dream, does it sync with today's international fora or international political landscape or strategic landscape? So these institutions, whether it is international department, whether it is the propaganda department, although we see major changes happening there, but at the same time, when we look at the leaders who run the show of these institutions are really in cahoots, or I wouldn't say cahoots with the party itself. So they are today, for suppose if you take example of the propaganda department, Huang who is the head of the propaganda department. He was an alternate member of the 18th Central Committee, but after Xi Jinping came, he was directly promoted to the Politburo. And not only the Politburo, but he became the the Central Committee member as a full member and being promoted to Politburo. And he is quite young. So they were more capable leaders than this. So this shows that how China's national rejuvenation dream, or the China dream that is within the domestic realm, actually reinforces what happens in the international. Similarly, as Dr. Bing just said, the party-based diplomacy, where there is a departure under Xi Jinping. Earlier, it was a traditional engagement process, but today, when we see its tentacles, especially during the COVID, diplomacy gives us an ample example how the international department of the party played a very proactive role in shaping the narrative, the COVID narrative in China and across the globe. So, and we see, and coming back to Jebin's paper here, one of the, I really wanted to, see this chapter, and Jebin, he talks about how political considerations that really shaped, that really impacts economic policies. Yeah. But as his strengths, in the paper also tries to show on the center-province relations in China. So, and he brings about that, and that really shows that how it is not only what the dream project of China is about, but it does cover over. There are different provinces, and as Professor Mohanty had already said in his presentation, disparities, regional disparities there. So even in center-province relations, like when we see from the 80s and from the 80s onwards, after the reform period started onwards, we see that some provinces are cash cows of the Chinese state, and some are not.
You have to wind up. Huh?
So just this one. So my suggestion, like my advice with for the other audience here is that this book has been a timely book. Actually, and it helps, like as I'm teaching comparative politics here, I would suggest a lot of younger students to really look at these chapters with keen eyes and look at the references. Those references very rich and very helpful for future research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now may I request PK Anand, our old colleague in ICS and now preparing to go to Taiwan, or are you already in Taiwan?
No, I'm still on the way, sir.
Yeah. Okay, on your way.
Yeah.
Okay, Anand, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Monty, and Happy New Year to all people here, especially all our friends from Vietnam. So hope this year, unlike the previous year, is more elevating and fulfilling for all of us. So with that, let me congratulate Jabin and all other contributors here for this wonderful volume. It is extremely timely and extremely important for from a lot of senses. And before I even venture into my role as a discussant in terms of discussing some of those chapters, let me also plug in that this was also a volume which kind of got away from me. In fact, I have had this thing with Jabin for long that I was also to be one of the contributors, but because of various things, it didn't fulfill, and I could not keep up with my promise with Jabin. So subsequently, I wish to put it on record here to him also that this is something which I would want to make up very soon, and so that I get on at the next available opportunity. So with that, let me go into the role which I have been given to as part of my remit on some of the chapters which I had, which I have to discuss of this book. I also thank Beam that his role as discussant came before, because that also gives me a segue into some of the other chapters which I am looking at this book, and especially since I have chosen the economic part of it and also the neighborhood relations. Though in the book the order appears in terms of the economic and the other parts come last, I would like to reverse that while doing this discussion process. So let me first get on to the 3 chapters on science and technology, rural revitalization, and SOEs and SOE reforms, and in which I would especially like to talk about the rural vitalization and SOEs, and especially rural vitalization, which is one of those chapters which I really enjoyed looking at and reading it. As Beam said, this is also in a sense giving, as also both the editors have also pointed out in their introductory note, that economy seems to be the central guiding force in terms of all these developments. While that is all the way true, but I could also pose it differently, that if you look at it differently, it need not be the economic part. I mean, all the chapters in the book give a sense that it is ultimately the party directed or the party state directed model that is driving, whether it is economy or foreign policy or even other development. So how long, or is it really economy, or is it the party state controlled economy or the directed economy that drives that may one may need to pose at that front. Coming to rural vitalization chapter by Prachi Agarwal, I think it was really a rich chapter in the sense, especially in volumes, whether it is on foreign policy or in terms of, or even in terms of BRI, which a lot of these chapters in foreign policy has is an important part of it. We do not generally see rural vitalization or agrarian issues figuring in, and I think bringing that into a conversation, one has to really commend both the editors of getting that in. And why food security or agrarian questions are important for China, it's not just from the sense of only food security or even in terms of or even agriculture. It is more comprehensive in sense of both integrating agriculture and rural development, and that is something which is a good takeaway from this book. And even for me, the imagination would have been that, okay, for China, for self-sufficiency, for food security, China has been going out and buying all these lands or even shifting some of these in outside its borders. But Prachi's chapter really argues that you need to look beyond just that. You have to look at various other programs or various other initiatives like joint ventures, or even buying into a lot of these foreign companies. And also there is a clear-cut strategy of engaging with underdeveloped countries and putting into their agrarian sector. So that is something which is very rich in terms of details and also very rich in terms of data. So that is one chapter which I really enjoyed and which I really look forward to covering. Also look forward to hopefully in some of the future publications this could come about. While reading that chapter and then Arvind's chapter on SOE reforms, I find there are a lot of common threads which could be looked into. So whether it be in terms of joint ventures with foreign companies, or in terms of mergers and acquisitions, or encouraging private investments. So those are some things which both those chapters had a lot of common trends and intertwined elements which one could easily look into. Also, the fact that both these chapters are talking about how both SOE reforms or even SOEs or agrarian tech and agricultural issues are also catching onto the coattails or latching onto the coattails of BRI. I mean, whether even in BRI investments, you are increasingly finding agricultural issues figuring in. And that is something which was also very important. Both these chapters, especially on the SOEs chapter, which was quite interesting from Arvind, is the fact that while there is a lot of reforms, and this is one of the constant questions which we have always grappled with on why there is, we talk about SOE reforms, there is general talk about reforms, but there doesn't seem to be a significant sense of reforms moving forward, but that the party's ultimate control remains. So the overall boundary of the party control remains, even though the other issues of the parties encouraging in terms of private investments or even entering into MOUs, entering into other joint ventures is being promoted and actively encouraged. But the party's final control seems to always remain. And that is something which the chapter also seems to reflect, that it will not go away. So that is something which we talk about much of the reforms, but nothing seems to be moving forward, or even removing the party doesn't seem to arise at this point. Coming to the foreign policy and especially the neighborhood policies, all the three chapters are really informative, and especially to reiterate what Beam said, a lot of original sources have been used. This one chapter which I really liked, of course, the chapter on South Asia by Prashant is extremely important. I mean, there is a lot of data, especially primary data, which he has very extensively used, and one needs to really commend him for that particular chapter. But something which caught my real attention was the chapter on Southeast Asia, and that chapter has a lot of offering on the fact that there seems to be disjuncture between ASEAN nations in terms of evolving a common policy towards China, and how China has increasingly been able to leverage that kind of a disunity and play its card quite well with all the Southeast Asian countries is something which is important in that chapter. But my particular point which I would like to focus upon is the challenges which is mentioned in that particular chapter on, and they are numerically and they are enumerated as political, economic, and cultural. But I think it is also important, it's also come to a time that we need to look at these cultural challenges much more seriously. I mean, you could easily sequence them and put them into different silos and say, okay, these are the fundamental challenges, these are under economy, you can easily club them under cultural. But I think the cultural is also political, and the cultural is also ideological. So maybe that is something a little more probing needs to be done. I mean, as with regards to the limits of time and regards to space, I think an edited volume always has its challenges. But I think the cultural factor is really something which needs to be argued or even probed or investigated much deeper upon. In fact, my own, as somebody who looks at labor, the cultural part is very significant from both a sociological and anthropological way, where you look at even like whether when you can easily club them, saying that okay, there are these Chinese investments coming into a particular country. Okay, there are cultural differences at the ground and there is pushback. But what are those cultural differences? It could even be racial. I mean, one can look at the example of Africa and how these investments have gone on, and what are those racialized things which are playing out on the ground, or the racialized issues which are at hand in terms of daily negotiations on the ground. So that is something which is important, and which I would say, rather than putting them into these silos, I think there are these points which would really need to be put or intermeshed. I mean, the cultural, political, and economic are all intermeshed rather than seeing them only as different. And
slowly try to wind up.
Yeah, my last couple of points is on, I mean, when this book has been, was reading through all the chapters, but somewhere down the line, the book seems to have stopped before in 2018. Of course, the book project started in 2018. But what has happened over the last 1 year, there seems to be a slight, it's an absence, or we are looking at all these new meanings which have come out in the last 1 year on how the pandemic has impacted, what in every sector it has impacted, how what are its implications for a lot of areas and lot of issues, subjects. Somehow the book seems to have stood at that time, and the 1 year we are trying, as we try to find meanings, I'm also trying to find meanings on each of those chapters, especially in terms of those foreign policy chapters, how they find resonance in this particular book, and how we can sort of take forward. Also, another important thing is on the US and the Indo-Pacific. The book again talks more of Trump and his policies, but already now we are into the Biden administration. So how does that carry forward? So the books, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the US presidency, seems to have come to a stop. And now we are taking these new learnings, and we are trying to sort of merge with them or speak with them on how these would need to be looked into. So the COVID particular thing, maybe that is, I'm just throwing it out there, being basically sowing the seeds for maybe another edited volume on how COVID, what are the meanings and what are the lessons, both in terms of China or also the rest of the world, how that kind of plays out. Maybe that is a project which to look forward to. But overall, to summarize, I think this is an important and very wonderful volume. I really enjoyed going through those sections. In fact, as I've discussed with Jabin, there are more chapters, even the chapters which Beam has read, I would be looking forward to reading them because it's also important to get a full comprehensive view of the book. But thank you and congratulations to all authors on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Anand. Now, I think it's time for the other editor, Dr. Javin Jacob, to come and reflect on several points made. And already from the chat box, we have some questions. You may address them, but we'll take them up later. Javin, please.
Thank you, sir. Let me quickly get underway. First of all, by acknowledging the many mentors, friends, seniors, colleagues that have taken time out to be present at this book discussion. Both my PhD supervisor as well as my two external examiners are present at this discussion. Dr. Huang, my co-editor, mentioned a previous volume that I'd worked on, that we had worked on, on China's neighborhood relations. Some of the colleagues who contributed to that volume are also present here. Let me sort of start by underlining this point, this point that Professor Mohanty made at the beginning, that, it's almost as if the domestic is what drives the external in terms of how our thinking of Chinese foreign policy or how the Chinese system operates is. It is exactly right. I mean, it is, we make no bones about it. The fact that for us, it is the domestic that drives Chinese foreign policy, which is why we try to integrate the domestic and the foreign policy elements in this. We start off with a section on domestic governance reforms. We use the 19th Party Congress as the sort of peg around which this discussion starts. So in many ways, that domestic element needs to be underlined. And also, unlike other books on China, again, as Anand also pointed out, Beam pointed out, the two discussants, that you seldom find books that talk about Chinese propaganda or science, tech, innovation, or state-owned enterprises, or agriculture, all in a volume on Chinese foreign policy. So it is, and all of these elements are linked intricately to what China is trying to do abroad as part of the BRI. So, the linkages between the domestic elements or considerations and the external are very much there. And what the authors in this volume have done is sort of explicate those in greater detail. And, much of this, even if, for example, Dr. Nyao's chapter on the International Liaison Department I mean, this, for those of us in India, this is particularly important because it is the ILD that has been in operation in Nepal for the last couple of years, right? The interactions between the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of Nepal have been through the ILD, the training sessions that the ILD has done in Nepal. So for those of you who are interested, even in South Asia, not just the chapter by my colleague Prashant on China-South Asia relations, but also Peter's chapter on the ILD will be very important. Now, of course, to address specifically the comments that Beam and Anand made, I think both of them have sort of underlined the point that an edited volume obviously cannot do everything. And throughout this exercise, many people, Anand included, had to drop out. So there were topics that we would have liked to cover, which we couldn't. But let me also say that, of course, this book came out in the middle of last year. So it was just after COVID hit, and perhaps too early for us to take on, add elements to, or too late perhaps to add elements related to COVID in the volume. But it does predict much of the responses, especially in Southeast Asia and in the immediate neighborhood, to what China would do. All right, and that's essentially, post-COVID is also about Chinese propaganda. So those two chapters, by my colleagues Peter and Roger Leo from Taiwan, are also important. And in fact, even the Trump, you say that, the fact is that post-Trump, we have much of the edifice of the Trumpian China policy in place. That has not been abandoned. Much of Trump's foreign policy is likely to be abandoned on Iran, on the Middle East, but on China, much of that will last. So in that sense, this book continues to remain relevant. It continues to predict as well as offer much insight for the post-COVID, post-Trump world. Now, I have maybe about 2 or 3 minutes left, and in this spirit that ICS has always been fertile ground for new ideas, new thinking, and to take off from what Anand talked about, how the cultural is also political. I've been thinking for some time about why Chinese studies, from the Asian continent is so different from what obtains in the Western world. One unique feature of this book is that it's an all Asian cast of characters, of authors. We have Indians, we have Vietnamese, we have Malaysian, we have a Malaysian author, and we have a Taiwanese author. So it's happy New Year for the Chinese, for Vietnamese, for Tibetans, for Taiwanese. It's all there. Now, just like we have, the third world approaches to international law, I think it's time now that we in Asia develop, or at least in Asia, perhaps the third world, given Africa is therefore a big player, a third world approach to China studies. China is big enough and is a big enough subject to require such an approach. And I think for too long in India, we've been sort of fallen between two stools. We have our own response to China, we have our own understanding of China, and yet we are forced to sort of tailor that to Western paradigms or Western frameworks. And frankly, that is not helping us beyond a point. It's important to use the methods are useful, certainly, but the approach needs to change. I think Orientalism is not as much a concern for Asian countries that deal with China as a hegemon. While concerns about Orientalism, have turned the West rather too cautious in speech and in rhetoric, even as these Western countries follow their own interests, right? While Asian countries are left sort of dealing with the consequences. They're caught in the middle, having to acknowledge and respond to the promises that the West makes as an ally, or especially the US as an ally to Japan or Taiwan or Philippines, that, oh, yes, we will deal with China, but basically leaving them high and dry. Look at what has happened in the South China Sea, right? So how then, and why then do we need to sort of approach China differently? Study China differently. Or why is the Asian approach or the third world approach to China studies important? Take a simple example. Today, Myanmar has just suffered a coup. But unlike in the past, it's not going to be the United States or the EU that is going to be the major player in Myanmar. It's going to be China, it's going to be India, it's going to be ASEAN, it's going to even be Japan. So these countries will have their own sets of interests. And the dominant discourse on China out of Washington D.C. think tanks appears, their priorities are different. China's stealing of technology, which is why we had that chapter on science and tech innovation, or the coercion of Western companies, etc., are the big issues. But for Asian countries, it is territorial aggression that is a big issue. But for the US, that's a minor issue. It's even something that they're willing to bargain with in a manner of speaking, given what has gone on in the South China Sea or the East Sea, as the Vietnamese call it, in the last few years. So, in terms of the reasons, nationalism and xenophobia are actually important tools of mobilization at all times in Asian countries. And these are not really frowned upon as it is in the West. So it is important to consider these and acknowledge the role that these play in bilateral ties with China for Asian countries. There's incomplete nation building. There's competition of Asian countries with their own neighbors, despite the fact that both countries might face the same sort of challenges from China. So there's a refusal to bandwagon against China. They are still much more comfortable, bandwagoning with external powers. Vietnam with India, perhaps, or Japan with the United States. Then economic development, of course, creates constituencies for engagement with China within these countries that's far more powerful than similar constituencies in the West. There's an acknowledgement of China's role in creating regional and global opportunities. Asian countries are not unaware that even as they have problems with China, they are also the ones that have benefited a great deal from engagement with China. And that sort of necessarily plays into thinking about China for policymakers. I mean, look at the way we've sort of gone about dealing with the problems at the line of actual control in Ladakh. And part of this is also this unique Asian characteristic of sticking to suboptimal regional or sub-regional organizations. Finally, liberalism and democracy, we might have democracies in Asia, but they are nowhere akin to democracies in the West. So these are not really particularly concerns for third world or Asian countries. The importance of specific leaders or even specific political parties or institutions is far greater in third world countries than it is in the case of Western nations dealing with China. And that in itself, therefore, creates a whole new set of objectives, dynamics in the way Asian countries look at China. And I think this is something that we need to acknowledge. So that's it. One final point as a way of going, talking about the future is that Beam and I are actually co-editing a special issue on the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China for the China Report. And that's where some of these new topics, new subjects will actually be brought in. And this is, again, an all-Asian cast of authors. Some of you are already part of this. And I hope that all of you will look forward to this next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jabin. And that last announcement was most relevant. Thank you. Well, we have something like 15 minutes left and for open discussion. There are some questions in the chat box. There are three. One was raised by Ambassador Kishan Rana, wanting details about the International Department and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the changing role of them. I think he has left, and there was some reply from Dr. Nyao. There is another question to me. I said that in the 2 years since the 19th Party Congress, there was no significant change in the development strategy. Dr. Eram Ashraf says there are several important changes, including the constitutional amendment on the term limits. I agree with you, Dr. Eram, that plus the security law and many changes, but not in the development strategy under Xi, the orientation that he had given, and the Xi-centric and party-led governance, and their sort of the global perspective on improving the status of China in the world. On those three things, there are no changes, even now. Then there is a question of the soft power, and this I think some of the authors should address. Some example of China's soft power diplomacy in Southeast Asia and especially Nepal. So those questions, please keep in mind. We'll have a round of responses from the contributors and the editors. Meantime, let's take a couple of more questions. Yes, Mr. Yogendra Kumar. Yes, Mr. Yogendra Kumar, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself and speak if you can hear me. Yeah.
Thank you so much. First of all, my congratulations on this book, which appears very interesting. And I also want to acknowledge Professor Jacob, because he very kindly helped me in my book, which has just come out by Routledge on geopolitics. I just want to make a broad conversation, a broad point about the China's renewal and rejuvenation, that sort of thing. The point actually is that if you compare it with the Soviet Union, for example, the Soviet Union actually emerged as a result at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Second World War, when there was already a kind of a global structure had emerged and a certain ideological component were added for it to play the role that it was playing. Now, in the case of China, a kind of a late, late emerging power, so to say, I do not even know whether it's in a position to impose the Tianxia, so to say, in the area where it thinks, or whether the mandate from the heaven is acceptable by everybody else, except, let's say, by the Chinese themselves. So my point actually is that, given a situation like this, there is no ideological attraction of China anymore, and particularly more complicated by making it the Chinese characteristics or whatever. I mean, they are certainly helping out certain countries, but even the BRI is stalling to a certain extent. So the kind of power structure, global power structure that emerged at the end of the Second World War, of which the Soviet Union was in one way a beneficiary, you don't find that situation happening nowadays. And my question actually, when you talk about rejuvenation, I don't know what kind of a trajectory of that rejuvenation we're expecting to have. I mean, in fact, China at the moment has an image problem, global image problem, and you can make out from the way they interact in various countries. Even, for example, the talk about reforms when they have the RCEP, for example. Now, RCEP, they're imposing sanctions in Australia, which actually is part of RCEP. So you can imagine all this talk about free market and so on and so forth. And again, the same thing in terms of influence in other countries. Just 1 second, please. I mean, for example, like in Nepal, they tried to intervene to resolve the faction fight. It didn't just work out. They just went back practically empty-handed. So my question actually is, now the rejuvenation we're talking about, I think that the trajectory is going to be very different. Thank you.
Thank you. May I also invite Mr. Vu Quy Son from Vietnam? You have a question? Did you hear me? I mean, there is a chat request there. Okay, who else? And yes, please.
Can you Can you listen to me?
Yeah.
I have a question to answer. I hope you can provide me some information regarding the impact of the legitimacy of CCP on China's foreign policies.
If I heard that correctly, somebody to explain the legitimacy of CCP on China's foreign policy.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that, in other words, is the CPC providing the main legitimacy today to China's foreign policy? And what are its consequences? I think that's a good question, and some of you should address that. Because foreign policy in most countries is considered as a state policy. And of course, the ex-Secretary of State never talked about PRC. It always talked about the Communist Party of China is doing this trade, this intervention, this hacking, this intervention, and so on. Okay, so that's a good question. Yeah, and I want to warn some friends. I would like this comment from some of you, a possible Patricia Oberoi and Madhavi Thampi, to Jabin's formulation in his last about the third world approach to China studies as the agenda to be set. Maybe Ambassador Ashok Kantha, if all of you or any of you can intervene after this first round. Yeah. Yes, Ananta, you have a question. Professor Ananta Kumar Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, sociologist.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohanty and friends. Now, Professor Mohanty, you mentioned about the challenge of relative deprivation.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you would like to elaborate it further. Now, the whole discourse of absolute poverty and relative deprivation may have the danger of being confined to the economic parameters. But in the Chinese case, also the whole question of dignity, like in the Muslim majority province and Uruguay and others, and the whole question of cultural rights. And if you like to elaborate it. My second query is in that vein, the whole discourse of national rejuvenation. And I wonder, while we witness this kind of state-centric nationalism, whether there is some stream of people's nationalism. And very briefly responding to the whole discourse of third world perspective of Chinese studies, my submission is that whether we need to rethink the very language of the third world today, because the very discourse of the third world is predicated upon an earlier geopolitical era. So how do we really engage with China from an Asian perspective, going beyond the dualism between the first world and the third world?
All right. No, on relative deprivation, I think all of us know as much as I can tell. So, but I agree with you. It's more than economic, certainly. Yes. Now, shall we have Professor Huang, and then Dr. Chu, then Dr. Nyao, and then I will ask maybe Patricia Oberoi, Madhavi, and Ashok. Yes, Dr. Huang.
Thank you so much for your comment and question. I think that's the question is very interesting. Yeah, and I also think that I also think that perhaps we concentrate on the explain how about the change the domestic policy and foreign policy from C. I think after the COVID-19 and after the U.S. New President Joe Biden gets the office, I think some China will some attack the domestic and foreign policy. First of all, I think China will domestic, especially in economics. They will really to take the action in the domestic policy in economy. Economy is they will push the domestic demand for the very important in the economic parameters. So the from foreign policy, the policy will, I think that they will have some assess action in the South China Sea or in East China Sea, especially in East China Sea has some action with Japan. It's action with takes the will challenge the U.S. the power U.S. in the Asian Pacific region, and I think they will have some attack to attack with India. I think that perhaps they will also they will has association with India. It also the challenge the U.S. because they think that they will gather the power from the other country and to compete with U.S. in the U.S. also changing the policy for the guiding more country together with U.S. compete the China. So India, Vietnam, Japan, and some country in the world in will separate with the China and U.S. policy. We have seen the Myanmar coup. We has been seen China one power, U.S. one power, and then they separate the Myanmar. So how about the India rule in the Myanmar coup? I don't know, but I think really think that China and U.S. has the role in the Myanmar coup. So I think that China will also change the policy to deal with the Myanmar. For example, they will stand as the military power, and they will have some support for the military of Myanmar.
Okay, thank you.
I think that the China will has some effects on our. So I think we have to continue to study about this. Yeah. Thank you
very much. Dr. Chu, please. Yes, Dr. Chu.
Thank you very much. And I think that the comments are very good, and I like the and response from the Jacob Jabin. I like his response on the issue that the book came out last year, so a number of things that we cannot update. But I agree with him that the book discussed general change in the U.S. Or in China development and its foreign policy. So I think that's a good point. And I would like to take the question from Mr. Sun. I don't know whether my answer is good, but I think Xi Jinping is now a very powerful person in China. He controls the party, he controls the government, he controls every institution in China. So his comment and his idea is a kind of a command for everyone to have to do in a authorization system like China. So I think Xi Jinping is very powerful, and he's a guy like a superman in China to run his country. So he's very, very powerful in terms of the foreign policy. So that I don't know whether my points are so it's good to from Mr. Sen.
Dr. Chu, if I can interrupt. For example, Deng Xiaoping also had full control over the party, army, government, everything.
Yeah.
But he had a very clear line about Tang Chang Chi Pa, divide the divide the party, government, and enterprises. So he very clearly made certain orientation for the state policies. State council became important in foreign policy, in governance, and so on. A party was important in ideological overall supervision. But that is not so. There is a change, very clear change of unification of institutional arrangements under Xi Jinping as a leader, and also party as the ever-present, omnipresent institution. So, so Dr. San's question, you have to answer whether party provides greater legitimacy or less. But if that happens in all the countries, for example, I will shudder if the ruling party, any ruling party, whether it is CPM or BJP or Congress or a regional party, directly administers our foreign policy. Foreign policy is a state activity, because state, apparently representing the whole people, projects itself to other states. So that question is very important in that sense. Yes, please, continue.
Yes, I agree with you that the Xi Jinping is a person who controls every institution in the China system. And it seemed to me that Xi Jinping is very powerful in current time and in coming time. So he will direct his foreign policy to his dream as a juvenilization. He said some years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Dr. New, please. New Ping. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think many good questions and comments from the discussants and other friends here. I think I will just be selective. I will pick something. I want to first, I think, echo what Dr. Japin Jacob has said about the non-Western approach, maybe Asian or third world, wherever. And exactly this is something that I have always been very interested in, starting from just Southeast Asia. I edited a book and published a book. It's published by Routledge. The title is Researching China in Southeast Asia. Came out, I think, 2 years ago. It's the first time that we try to map out the state of China studies in 6 or 7 Southeast Asian countries. Very interesting. I try to see if there is some kind of common, some kind of approach or something like that, but actually I could, it's too diverse in a way, but perhaps that was just a beginning. Perhaps there's more needs to be done. I will see that I kind of feel that this, yes, there are something common, but it's also something that is very difficult because non-West is just too diverse in a way. The West, in a way, is kind of, for whatever differences there are, they have a more or less common heritage or something, but this is not really the case in Asia or other parts. This is something that I continue to be very interested in and happy to share and contribute along. And then I think a brief comment about soft power. I won't comment on the specific. I don't know about Nepal and things like that. It's not my expertise area, but I think the soft power somewhat is the overused concept. I'm guilty of that also, but we have to disaggregate the concept. It's become too generalized, and sometimes it doesn't serve some kind of purpose, analytical purpose anymore, because there are very different dimensions of what we call soft power, and for different reasons or different interests, and different groups, different stakeholders in a society will align their interests with these different components of soft power. So there are many dimensions of it. So in that sense, it's rather, I would say, we have to move forward to just have a very generic concept of soft power. Finally, I think I would just want to add a bit more point about just Professor Mohanty talked about Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. I think they are roughly they are the same, of course, in terms of being powerful and in control and everything. But I think Xi is actually, my view, is a bit more powerful given the information we have. I don't know, but Deng Xiaoping is known that he was somehow constrained by Chen Yun, the same revolutionary generation that came from him. Even though they all saw him as a #1 leader, but they could act in some way to constrain him. But don't see that is the case of Xi. In that sense, I think he's even beyond Deng Xiaoping already. That is the first thing. But the another is that a lot of the policies of things that he came out, the separation of party, government, enterprises, so on and so forth, fit the situation of China in late 1970s, early 1980s. It was a different era, different domestic situation, different international situation, different allies, different partners. Thing was trying to reach out to the US, integrate with the world, and so on and so forth. I think Xi Jinping is not acting alone. I think he is my guess only. I could be wrong, but I think the party leadership make a diagnosis of all sorts of domestic international problems faced by China, and I think their prescription is that the separation is not necessarily a good model. It fit in the 70s and 80s up into the 90s, but it doesn't fit current situation, and they need a the integration unification again that we see and that's been carried out by Xi Jinping. I think the Hu Jintao era has a lot to do with it. The Hu Jintao, I think, in their own diagnosis, display and manifest many of the flaws of the separation model, and then they try to correct it, and perhaps they overcorrected it. They overdo it, or maybe not. I don't know, because it's their own diagnosis. But I think the era is different between what Deng was thinking at the time and what Xi Jinping is thinking right now. So that would be some of my few reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would suggest that one ICS Wednesday seminar be devoted to this issue of Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, the two eras, in terms of particularly this question of party, government, and enterprise separation versus unification. That will be most interesting, and to be initiated by Dr. Nyao. Okay, and we have people like Bhim Subba, who closely watch these institutions and personnel. So we should have a very interesting discussion.
Yeah,
I know Hemant and many others have questions, but Patricia, do you have? Will you agree to come in for a brief comment, and then Madhavi, if possible?
Well, just the very briefest comment. I was going back to Jabin's couple of comments, one of which was the emphasizing the interrelationship of the domestic and the external, and the second one was the whether there can or should be a different China studies, a non-Western China studies enterprise going on. And it really took me back to the very foundational debates that we had in the ICS in the 1970s, when these positions were very hotly debated by Giri Deshankar and Meera Sinha Bhattacharjee in particular. And ICS continually said that it wanted its special special thing to be the relationship of the domestic and the foreign. And this is so important when one hears people who talk only about foreign relationships, a little bit about leadership styles, and foreign policy, without any relationship to the domestic in international relations. So that was one thing. And I think the interesting corrective to that was Mr. Chu just now, who said that, well, probably there is not an Asian commonality that, that one can say is non-Western point of view. So I think this question is going to go on, and one is reminded of, all the Pan-Asianist questions that have been going here and there. But I thought it was a very good discussion, and I congratulate also the organization of the discussants in terms of the themes that were around which the chapters were organized. I thought Bim brought that out very nicely. Sorry, I've taken too long, but that's,
no. Thank you.
That's what happens to you when you invite me to speak.
Thank you. And Madhavi, are you around? Madhavi, Are you around? No? Ashok Kantha, our director, would you like to comment especially on the last point? Ashok? Then Professor Srimati Chakrabarti. Srimati, would you like to come in?
I think, Manu, we are running out of time.
I know. I was waiting to hear that, but we have just crossed about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just two sentence comment on very important point made by Jabin.
Yeah.
Need for a third world approach on China or non-Western approach on China. This point is very valid. In fact, in ICS also we keep talking about it all the time. Need to develop a uniquely Indian perspective on China, but it will be difficult to find a common approach emanating from third world countries. So there'll be multiple approaches that will emerge from these countries. So let's talk about non-Western approach rather than a common third world approach on China. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Srimati, are you able to come in? Okay, then Hemant, who has raised some interesting points. I would request Hemant to give the last word and then ask Jabin to conclude. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. No, I just raised a question towards the end because during the discussion also, there's a lot of confusion when we talk about whether we should have a third world perspective or non-Western perspective. I think it's also important that we should also be very clear what is the Chinese perspective on China itself. And in that sense, there is a lot of confusion. People at will refer to, for example, China Dream. Is it China Dream or Chinese Dream for that matter? And I don't know. I think both the terms are very different and perhaps mutually conflicting with each other. But why is it that we don't tend to follow what the Chinese say and we carry on with China Dream? I mean, that was one way of looking at the whole discussion. That's what I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think that was a very interesting discussion. Jabin, you can conclude.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Professor Mohanty, and thank you once again to ICS for organizing this. I will just very quickly, make a few points. It's a bit of my habit to sort of throw in a few the cats among the pigeons and see where the discussion goes. And I think that's part of the endeavor of all academics. So, look, one of the things that I want to sort of underline is that, I'm not saying that the Asian continent or the third world space isn't diverse. But in the first instance, as I think Ambassador Kanta pointed out, is to point out that there is a non-Western approach. I mean, clearly, and some of the points I sort of highlighted in terms of lack of institutional support or lack of institutions in terms of foreign policy establishment. And the foreign policy establishment in practically in all third world countries are very narrow, closed spaces that do not acknowledge input from outside. So that itself is a commonality that you will find in all non-Western approaches, right? So there is that nationalism, the inability to sort of forget the past. These are all important commonalities. So I think there is something there. Then the thing is that it's only subsequently that we start developing this sort of a third world approach. I mean, first you acknowledge that there is a non-Western approach, then you see what is the third world approach, and eventually the third world will also have to sort of split or splinter. There will be an African approach, there will be an Asian approach, a Southeast Asian approach. And mind you, we are talking about China studies. So China itself is not a player. I mean, Eamon's point is right, that Chinese have their own approach, but that is not of consequence right now because it is their point of view. What we are interested in is what is the other point of view on China, right? And therefore, it is not the same as pan-Asianism. I mean, it is an acknowledgement that pan-Asianism does not exist, that there is this diversity in the West. You could also ask, do third world scholars doing studies on China in the West count towards creating a third world approach? I would say yes, but depends on what their particular field of focus is and whether they are acknowledging their location as well, as third world scholars, or are they talking about China from sitting in the West from a Western perspective? So that is there is also that. And finally, let's also acknowledge that there are third world scholars studying China in China, and that might also become a thing. So that approach also will form part of this third world approach. I mean, how do Indians studying in China about China deal with China? And I think those of you who have experienced that will know that that approach is very, very different from anybody trained in the US or in Europe. So I just sort of wanted to leave it at that, and thank you all for your patience and staying on for so long, and for joining us in this discussion. Over to you, Professor Mohanty.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And Dr. Huang, Dr. Chu, Dr. Nyao, Son, we also in India have mid-January as the new year in Kerala, Andhra, Assam, in so many places. So January 1st is only the global Christian calendar, which of course we also observe greatly, but we also have our own New Year greetings. Therefore, Happy New Year again, and thank you all very much. And remember, we will have at least 2 seminars, one on the party government enterprise differentiation, one on non-Western approaches to China studies. So thank you all very much, and thank you for organizing this discussion.
Thank you. Bye. Happy New Year.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
To my colleagues especially. Thank you.
See you again. Yeah.